I referred to slavery several times, but I think this is a good point at which to pause and focus just on the institution of slavery itself before going on. I want to look at slavery in terms of statistics, geography, and the experiences of slaves. First of all, statistics. In the South in the mid-1800s, there were approximately 4 million slaves held in bondage, compared to approximately 8 million white Southerners. This is a staggering number, approximately half of the population. But let's break it down further. Out of those white Southerners, 25% of households owned slaves. Okay, 1 in 4 were slave-owning households. So it certainly isn't true that all white Southerners were slave owners. Among those 25% that did own slaves, very few of those owned more than 20 slaves on large plantations. They were generally smaller plantation owners with a few slaves. But still, don't let those statistics deceive you. The South was very much committed to maintaining this institution of human bondage, and those who were not slave owners themselves very often were committed to the institution, either in hopes of one day becoming big plantation owners themselves, or already profiting from the institution. Sometimes poorer whites would lease or borrow, rent slaves from larger plantation owners. And not only the Southern economy, but the entire United States economy was very much tied to the institution of slavery. There were about 2,000 free African Americans in the South and about 3,000 free African Americans in the North. This is very few compared to the millions held in slavery, but nevertheless, they had a significant presence. What about the geography of slavery? Slavery was unevenly distributed throughout the South. I want you to think of the South not just in terms of the South, but subdivided regions, the Upper South, in border states like Kentucky, Tennessee, the Middle South, and finally the Lower South. The farther south you go, the greater the concentration there was of slavery. Slavery, of course, had a strong presence in the South not only because of a need for labor, but also as a means of race control, with many white Southerners looking down on the slaves, seeing them as inferior, and also fearing them, as we saw Thomas Jefferson comparing slavery to having the wolf by the ears. What about the experiences of slaves? They varied, of course. Slaves didn't all experience the same things. Many of them were field hands. I suppose this is our stereotypical image of the slave life. But there were also household servants. Conditions varied depending on where they lived and who the master was. But very often slaves had a subsistence existence, only having enough food to survive. Masters often saw their slaves as an economic investment. They didn't want to starve them to death or beat them to death for that matter, because they had money invested in their labor. But on the other hand, they certainly didn't live very comfortably in many cases. They underwent many types of abuse, not only the physical abuse that comes to mind at first, whipping, for example, and sometimes being beaten to death to make an example for other slaves, but there was also mental abuse. The simple fact of being told that you are property, not a person, and being denied basic rights is in itself mental abuse. There was also sexual abuse present on many plantations. When it came to a slave standing in the eyes of the law, well, they had no voice in court. They couldn't testify against say, a white master who had abused a slave, they had no rights in court. They didn't even have the right to get an education. In southern states, it was illegal to teach a slave to read and write. They weren't even allowed to be married legally. Of course, slaves lived together as husband and wife. They made promises to each other. They had their own rituals, sometimes jumping over top of a broom. But in the eyes of the law, they were not legally married. That would have created problems for masters who were accustomed to having the right to separate spouses, selling one down the river and keeping the other. In many southern churches, marriage of slaves was recognized, but as far as legal standing goes, it was non-existent. The slave trade, as I've referred to, often broke up slave families. As you might imagine, the life of a slave was not the easiest life. That's an understatement. And you would expect many slaves to be unhappy with their lives and to display resistance to their bondage. Let's talk about this subject of submission and resistance. In the mid-1800s, there was a popular myth in the South, the myth of the happy slave. And as abolitionists were criticizing slavery, Southerners were quick to defend slavery, very often resorting to this myth, claiming that slaves were happy and that they were better off as slaves. Part of this myth can refer to the fact that there were few examples of slave rebellions and runaway slaves. The vast majority of slaves did outwardly appear to accept their fate as slaves, but that can be deceiving. When someone shows outward submission, does that necessarily mean they are inwardly submissive, or are there some other factors such as fear? Let's look at some different examples of resistance. Not all forms of resistance are the same. Some forms of resistance are as minor as not working as fast as you could, or accidentally, not really accidentally, breaking a hoe and having to slow down for part of a day. These are very subtle forms of resistance, and yet they do show resistance. Compare that to some more major forms of resistance. Fugitives. There were examples of runaway slaves. There were famous runaways like, for example, Frederick Douglass. There were many who escaped through the Underground Railroad before the Civil War. But if you compare the number of runaways to the overall number of slaves, it didn't happen all that often. Does that mean that most slaves were happy and didn't want to run away? Or did it mean that they weighed the risks and were afraid of the consequences of being caught? It was very difficult to successfully run away from slavery and escape to freedom. Very often, fugitives were recaptured, and in retaliation, not only were their lives much more miserable than before, but things were more difficult for their family and their fellow slaves after a runaway attempt. The same is true for rebellions. There aren't very many examples of slave rebellions. There were some, like Nat Turner's famous rebellion in Virginia in 1831, where for a while Nat Turner and his followers were successful in surprising masters, killing them in the night, but very quickly they were outnumbered by white Southerners who then turned on them, and in the end, the overall plot failed. Not only did they lose their lives, but fellow slaves, who usually had nothing to do with it and knew nothing of the plans, also suffered the consequences. We've been talking about the institution of slavery, human bondage, but I want to make a distinction between that and what we call the slave power, When I refer to the slave power, I'm talking about the political power that slave states held in Congress. We've already studied the Missouri Compromise. When the situation with Missouri threatened to split the nation over the expansion of slavery, this sounded what was called a fire bell in the night, a warning signal to Americans that the issue could very well divide the nation. Of course, the Missouri Compromise put off the issue for a while, but the debate over the slave power certainly did not go away. During this time, the abolitionist movement was growing, gaining more and more attention, and abolitionists were writing petitions to Congress confronting them about the issue of slavery. Congress responded with the gag rule, where they refused to pay attention to these petitions, basically gagging the abolitionist movement. That would not stop the movement either. The issue would not go away. And as America continued to expand, taking on more and more territory, the issue presented more and more urgency. In a previous lecture, we talked about the Mexican War and how that as a result we acquired new territory. This sparked a huge debate in Congress over the future of slavery. Before I explain how this was settled for the time with another compromise, let me mention 4 plans that 4 different men proposed in order to deal with the question of slavery in the territories. First of all was Wilmot. Wilmot suggested that no territory should be open to the expansion of slavery. Obviously, that made the North happy, but the slave power saw it as a threat. It certainly was not a successful plan. On the other hand, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina suggested the opposite, that Congress had no right to keep slavery out of any of the territories. The South loved the idea, the North hated it. President Polk had somewhat of a compromise when he suggested simply extending the old Missouri Compromise line. Just as before, territory above that line was barred from slavery, but slavery could expand south of that line. But in this time period of rapid expansion, the old compromise line was breaking down. And one more possibility was suggested by Lewis Cass. That was the idea of popular sovereignty. According to popular sovereignty, it would be left up to the people of the territories to decide for themselves on the future of slavery in those territories once they became states. We will see later on that although the idea of popular sovereignty sounds like a neat and tidy democratic process, it certainly didn't work out that way. Okay, what actually did happen? In the year 1850, Congress worked out a compromise over this issue of slavery in the territories. Once again, Kentucky's Henry Clay was instrumental in forging this compromise. Henry Clay would die very soon after this, and the next time the issue was revisited, the great compromiser was not there to participate in the debate. What was accomplished in the Compromise of 1850? First of all, California would enter the Union as a free state. Remember from before, Californians usually wanted to be free from slavery. That is certainly a concession to the free states of the North. Secondly, the Compromise of 1850 ended the slave trade in Washington, D.C. Sure, this was just one city. The slave trade was still alive and well throughout the South, but it's symbolic. That slave trade was barred from Washington, D.C. was a symbolic critique of slavery. Like any compromise, this had elements for both sides, and in order to please the South, the compromise opened territories, the New Mexico Territory and Utah Territory, to popular sovereignty. Okay? If you look at these territories, you'll see that portions were up above the old compromise line. So this is a concession to the South. Territories that were once barred from slavery are now open to the possibility of its expansion. Finally, the Compromise of 1850 also included a tougher fugitive slave law. There had always been a fugitive slave law, where if fugitives escaped from slavery, they could be recaptured even in free states in the North and returned to their masters. But this new version of the fugitive slave law had more provisions for enforcement. It required Northern officials to carry out duties of slave catchers and is also corrupt in paying judges more if they ruled that an alleged runaway was in fact a runaway slave.